Hello there, my name's Bill Roots, and I'm a composer, singer-songwriter, and part-time music tutor. Several years back when I was a teenager and growing up as fast as I possibly could, after doing several years of music studies and playing in several unmotivated small-time cover bands for mostly house parties, me and a couple of friends formed several original material playing rock metal style groups with whom I had the opportunity to make records and play shows with across a large portion of New Zealand for several years. After those groups ran out of steam and disbanded, I decided to set up my own basic home recording studio, in which I now compose and record my own solo records, as well as music for film and various screen media platforms that may require it. The rest is history being written right in front of you, my friends.
So ladies and gentlemen, imagine yourselves in a scene such as this. Your alarm goes off early in the morning, and you think to yourself, man, I've got to do this again and again and again. I take it we've all been there before, right? I'm sure we have. Well, this song here is just a little bit of blues about such subject that we've had to go through, all of us at some point when we've had to study something that we can't possibly understand at the beginning of it, but we managed to find our way there in the end, don't we? So this song touches on that subject, and it's called The AM Blues. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Journey by receiving my first acoustic guitar from my parents at around the time of my 7th birthday. Also from about this age and up to my early teens, I began learning all the guitar riffs, melodies and chords from my father's blues and folk music cassette tapes, not to mention watching him play piano and guitar hours on end throughout my childhood. I began writing silly little songs with simple chords and lyrics about things that amused me, as well as odd little musical maps and sketchings that I actually very rarely got to hear the final result of, but they were nevertheless interesting for me to draw as a kid. The other side of my musical journey was my introduction to basic kids level classical training in the school choir when I was about 9 or 10 years old, which was also my introduction to slightly more serious musical arrangement and discipline, as well as studying further more serious music theory studies slightly later in my life when I was finally mature enough to listen, of course. By the time I was in my late teens, I had decided to become more serious about my musical pursuits, initially as a songwriter and guitar player, so I'd converted to playing electric guitar and began playing local gigs with a couple of rock, blues and metal bands, the more widely known outfit of all of them being good old Blackleaf Gardens, of course. This being my introduction to the music industry on a slightly more professional level, and it's been a bizarre journey ever since. As far as the slightly more intense composition side of things go, even though I was already working on my own songs from quite a young age and getting more serious with that stuff from my mid-teens onwards in local bands, on the flip side to that, from a very young age I had a bizarre little side hobby of sketching little abstract/graphic notation style compositions and musical maps, based on things that randomly interested me as a kid, purely out of boredom of course, as well as always trying out my ideas using the arrangement training I received in the school choir. However, it wasn't until I was in my later teen years that I really realised that serious composition and arranging was a strong passion for me, considering I'd never been exposed to similar experimental artists or felt any sense of compositional accomplishment until this later point in my life, not to mention as a teenager suddenly having much more access to platforms of media than I did several years earlier. To my benefit, I discovered so many more intricate and, at least to me, so many more interesting musical styles, such as various rock, metal, jazz, classical, Middle Eastern music, as well as many avant-garde and progressive rock groups from the 60s and 70s onwards. I believe the first real creative thrill and turning point really occurred for me when I had sketched out a rather complex and unusually structured instrumental concept called photosynthesis, which was sort of a musical map based on the subtle inconsistencies of the shape of a sunflower's symmetry, and I had decided to go out on a limb and bring it to my band at the time to hear what it sounded like being played by rock band instruments. being all that we had at the time, of course. And it was a roaring creative success for me for the first time ever. That was definitely the turning point for me as a composer, as it was the very first time I actually got to audibly hear some of my more abstract, non-singer-songwriter style musical ideas, because they had just been inaudible musical sketches on paper until then. So that was an artistic thrill I've been trying to replicate ever since, in any way I can, really. I was always quite curious, and sometimes a bit of a troublemaker as a boy. My parents were always very supportive of my curiosity, so they would send me to theatre and drama classes from a young age, in which I learned a lot about creative writing and literature. Not to mention I found my love of improvisation via theatre studies and theatre sports. So with all that in mind, I really like to include many of these teachings via use of lyrics and theatrics in my own music, as I've always preferred to write about exterior topics and subjects rather than about my own life, like many songwriters tend to anyway. I've always been a fan of satirical and cynical people. Even as a child, I had a strong sense of sarcasm and a need for practical joking around, which didn't always land me in the greatest of situations, especially in my high school years, as I was always getting into trouble with the teachers, and even sometimes fellow students, if they weren't one of my partners in crime, that is. But alongside most other things I do in my life, I'm always more amused if I'm making fun of something that I find slightly absurd in the process, and my lyrics are certainly no exception to that rule. Speaking of theatrics and music, I recently got into the filmmaking business, and by that I mean taking care of the musical side of things anyway. However, this has its own set of challenges compared to making records. Don't get me wrong, both require a lot of patience and decision-making skills. However, as I said earlier, I've always been fascinated with musical mapping around predetermined structures, and so with this in mind, having the freedom of working with multiple genres for different jobs, I would say calling this line of work enjoyable isn't even doing it justice. I could do this stuff multiple times over and over and not get bored with it. Might need to upgrade some of the gear soon though. Pass on my knowledge and pay the renting course. I've also been teaching guitar and music part-time casually over the last 7 years or so, and I find it's a wonderful way of carrying on the good feelings that music can give us through knowledge and enjoyment of the craft. So that's just another side of my career I wish to build up, alongside being a commissioned composer and songwriter for ensembles and groups all over the world, as well as multiple media platforms that utilise all sorts of musical styles, like film, video games, advertising, web music, musical logos, plus engagement and session musician work when I can as much as possible, because it's all part of the bigger opportunity to do what I love, and preferably be able to make a fairly decent living from doing it too, of course. At the end of the day though, a raw jam can't be passed by, because that was the initial goal anyway, and like pretty much anybody on the planet, the aim is to fill out my time doing what I love as much as I possibly can, and that's all I could ever ask for, really. Anyway, that's all. You may be excused now.